What if I told you that one of the closest moments humanity ever came to nuclear war didn't involve generals, presidents, or missiles? At least not directly, but a bored radio operator making a joke. No red button, no high-level briefing, just a single phrase, casually spoken over military frequencies that set off a chain reaction of panic, confusion, and near-apocalyptic readiness. This isn't a scene from a satire or a Cold War thriller. It happened. And the most chilling part? Almost no one outside a tight circle of defense analysts knows about it. Today, we're going to dissect the butterfly effect of a moment so absurd it sounds made up. And yet, it nearly tipped the world over the edge. To understand how a joke could become a spark in the nuclear powder keg, we have to rewind to the height of the Cold War, when every radar blip, every garbled message, every shift in flight patterns was filtered through a lens of paranoia. The year is 1983. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union are reaching a boiling point. NATO has begun conducting large-scale military exercises, one of which, known as Able Archer 83, simulates a nuclear release with such realism that Soviet leadership begins to suspect it's not an exercise at all. Meanwhile, the USSR's own early warning systems are glitchy, error-prone, and, as we now know, terrifyingly close to launching retaliatory strikes based on false alarms. It's in this atmosphere of suspicion and hair-trigger readiness that our story takes place, on board a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, somewhere over the Arctic Circle. The crew is mid-mission, tasked with monitoring Soviet military activity near the northern border. Among them is a radio man, call him Sergeant X, who's responsible for logging encrypted communications and maintaining the aircraft's link to ground command. But after hours of monotony, boredom sets in, and that's when he decides to liven things up. During a routine check-in, he casually adds an off-script phrase, muttering into his mic. Looks like it's time to push the button. The tone? Sarcastic. The intention? Harmless, but the impact? Anything but. Because what Sergeant X doesn't realize is that his transmission isn't just being heard by his own base. It's also picked up, loud and clear, by Soviet listening stations. And in a moment like this, with both sides on edge, even a joke can be interpreted as a signal. What makes this incident so dangerous isn't just the transmission itself, it's the context in which it lands. The Soviets, at the time, were running their own network of surveillance outposts and signal intelligence stations across the Arctic and Eastern Europe. Their job? Catch anything that hinted at a surprise attack. And in late 1983, their ears were tuned to paranoia. Just weeks earlier, the Soviet early warning system had nearly triggered an actual nuclear response after mistaking sunlight reflecting off clouds for incoming American missiles. That false alarm was stopped barely by the calm judgment of one man, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. He decided not to report what the computer was screaming, but that moment had already revealed a terrifying fragility in the Soviet chain of command. And now, this offhand American voice crackles over the frequency with the words, "Looks like it's time to push the button." It's just ambiguous enough to be terrifying. Was it a code phrase? A countdown confirmation? Was this reconnaissance flight the first signal of an imminent launch? Soviet analysts had strict orders. Any phrase or action that matched known nuclear protocols had to be flagged and reported immediately. Within minutes, the intercepted message was pushed up the chain of command. Not because they thought it was definitive, but because in Cold War logic, not reporting even a shred of potential evidence could cost you your career. Or worse. In a system driven by fear, overreaction wasn't punished, underreaction was. And so the message moved, up from the signal crew to local command to the general staff. On the American side, no one even knew the message had been intercepted. The crew landed, went through routine debrief, and chalked it up as another uneventful mission. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Soviet commanders were activating contingency procedures. Missile forces were placed on alert status. Certain radar systems were refocused toward potential launch zones. And perhaps most disturbingly, a handful of mobile launch units were ordered to reposition, an action that, under standard Soviet doctrine, typically preceded preparations for first strike capability. None of this triggered a direct American response, because none of it crossed the threshold of visibility. The Soviets were moving within their own territory, below the line of open escalation. But what this did trigger was internal alarm. Among the small cadre of Soviet officers with access to the Able Archer briefings and decoded Western procedures, there was a sickening realization. If this line really was part of a launch protocol, then they might already be too late. But if it wasn't, If it was just noise, then every step they took toward counterstrike would only amplify the danger. A single phrase said in jest had created a moment of quantum uncertainty. The future now hinged on interpretation, and interpretation hinged on fear. To understand just how close this came to catastrophe, we need to examine the timing. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolded in the shadow of Operation Able Archer, the most realistic NATO war game the Soviets had ever seen. And that's the problem. To NATO, it was just a drill. To Moscow, it looked like the real thing. Beginning on November 2nd, 1983, just days after the offhand comment from the American navigator, Able Archer simulated the escalation of conflict from conventional warfare to nuclear exchange, complete with coded messages, new communication protocols, and the unprecedented involvement of actual heads of state in the final simulation phase. The whole thing was meant to be immersive, too immersive. Soviet leadership, still reeling from intelligence failures of the past, didn't see a drill. They saw a cover. In fact, for months, the KGB had been running Operation Ryan, a global surveillance campaign tasked with detecting signs of a Western first strike. Ryan wasn't based on facts, it was based on fear. Soviet doctrine had become so paranoid that mere patterns, like changes in embassy lights or increased hospital blood supplies, were being logged as possible signs of nuclear preparation. In this mindset, a joke over the radio wasn't funny, it was confirmation. Meanwhile, NATO, unaware of how close they were to the line, kept pressing forward with the simulation. By November 8th, the war game reached its final phase. Nuclear release procedures were rehearsed, command posts went dark, real-world military readiness ticked upward, if only slightly. But for the Soviets, it was the final puzzle piece. They had the intercepted message. They had the escalating drill. They had no back-channel explanation. Inside the Kremlin, meetings grew tense. Marshal Ogarkov and other members of the general staff debated the evidence. Some urged restraint. Others were convinced. This was it. The West was preparing a decapitation strike. Soviet nuclear forces were quietly put on enhanced alert. Not DEFCON style, not headline grabbing, just quiet, deadly readiness, one step away. And all of this because one American crewman, exhausted and likely bored on a long patrol, said what he thought was a joke. He had no idea what it meant to say push the button within earshot of a hyper-alert adversary locked in a paranoia spiral. No idea that his voice would echo through translation rooms and intelligence reports, that generals would sit in dim-lit chambers weighing the odds of apocalypse. No idea that, in a different timeline, his words might have been the last sound before launch orders were given. But here's where the story takes its sharpest, most ironic turn. The Soviet system was many things, rigid, centralized, suspicious, but it wasn't completely blind. In East Germany, in a dimly lit room filled with monitors and decoding gear, a young Soviet intelligence officer flagged something odd in the sequence of events. The war games were escalating, yes, but they weren't following expected real-world mobilization patterns. No spikes in troop movement outside of the simulation zones. No satellite-confirmed increases in Western submarine activity. No changes to nuclear weapon deployment sites. It was tense, yes, but something didn't add up. And this is where an unlikely figure enters the picture. Lieutenant General Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB officer turned skeptic of the agency's paranoia. Kalugin, despite being out of the inner loop by this point, had sown doubts years earlier about the reliability of Ryan. His critiques had quietly circulated, embedding a sliver of uncertainty in the minds of a few key figures still inside the Soviet hierarchy. When conflicting reports from field stations began to pile up, some confirming threat signals, others showing silence, the weight of Kalugin's old warnings lingered. Could it all be noise? Was the West really preparing for nuclear war? Or was the Soviet machine just seeing ghosts? Inside a classified briefing on the night of November 9th, just hours before Able Archer would conclude, one senior Soviet analyst reportedly voiced the unthinkable. "What if this is theater?" he asked. "A drill, not a dagger?" The room fell silent. To acknowledge that possibility meant two things. First, that they'd nearly misread the situation. And second, that the American navigator's message, "We're going to go ahead and push the button now," might not have been a threat, but a joke, a mistake. A line meant to break the monotony of a long flight, never intended to ripple across oceans and nearly trigger apocalypse. And here's the kicker. That's exactly what saved the world. Because instead of escalating further, the Soviet command quietly pulled back. Alert levels were maintained, but no counter-movements were launched. No missiles moved, no warheads armed, just stillness. Waiting, watching. And then, as Able Archer ended on November 11th, the tension broke. The drills stopped. The world kept turning. But only just. The navigator's name was never released publicly. The exact tape, if it still exists, is locked deep inside US archives. But intelligence documents declassified years later confirmed the near miss. One transmission, one assumption, one system on edge. And it all came down not to strategy or doctrine or military superiority, but to interpretation. To whether someone in a soundproofed room thousands of kilometers away believed the voice in their headphones meant it. This wasn't the first time the world had brushed past the edge of annihilation. We remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We study it in schools, dissect the photos, quote the speeches. But this near miss didn't make headlines. There were no grainy black and white TV addresses, no dramatic naval blockades, no ticking clocks broadcast to millions. Instead, it was quiet, buried in intelligence files, hidden under layers of bureaucracy and decades of silence. But make no mistake, it was real. And what's perhaps most terrifying is how little agency anyone involved actually had. The American crewmen didn't know Soviet ears were listening. The Soviet analysts didn't know it was a joke. The generals didn't know if the war games were games at all. Everyone was reacting to shadows. Ghost signals, data without certainty. And that's where we hit the core of the story. The real lesson beneath the surface. Nuclear tension isn't just about weapons. It's about systems. Misaligned, mistrusting, massively overbuilt systems that don't communicate. Systems that can take one spark, one line over a radio, and set entire nations into motion. Think about it. What if that Soviet analyst hadn't voiced his doubt? What if one Soviet commander spooked by Ryan's directives had greenlit a mobilization? What if just one radar operator on the American side had mistaken the response as aggression and reported it up the chain? You don't need an army of villains to start a nuclear war. Sometimes all it takes is one misinterpreted word, and here's where the irony deepens. That single voice, crackling over open airwaves, wasn't carrying classified intel or issuing coded threats. It was just one man, tired, likely bored, making a dumb joke. But in the context of a global paranoia feedback loop, that joke became a variable. A variable in a system that had no room for humor, no room for improvisation, only protocols, probabilities, and paranoia. The Cold War wasn't a chess match. It was a blindfolded sprint through a minefield, where one wrong step, one misunderstood signal could end civilization. And we didn't avoid it because of superior planning or flawless diplomacy. We avoided it because someone somewhere stopped and said, "Wait, let's double check before we act." That pause, that second guessing, that's what saved us. And that brings us to the final irony of this entire story. The world didn't come inches from nuclear annihilation because of ideology or aggression or any formal military strategy. It came that close because of a single sentence spoken over an open radio channel. A joke. A joke made by a bored radio navigator who didn't know that Soviet ears were listening, and that those ears belonged to people primed to expect the worst. What should have been dismissed as a moment of gallows humor was instead treated as a puzzle piece in a much darker narrative. A narrative built not on reality but on fear, projection, and pre-programmed suspicion. It's easy to laugh now knowing how it ended. But imagine you're the analyst in that bunker hearing the phrase, "The missiles are ready. Just say the word," with no context, no emotion, just static and signal. Do you report it? Do you risk being wrong? Or do you assume it's noise and possibly doom your country? This is the terrifying beauty of Cold War history. The edge wasn't guarded by logic or peace treaties. It was guarded by humans. Flawed, tired, emotional, distracted humans. And sometimes, all that stood between life and extinction was someone deciding not to overreact. Or someone asking one more question before passing a report up the chain. This story is a stark reminder of just how fragile stability really is. Not just during the Cold War, but today too. In a world still filled with automated systems, instant communication, and high-stakes weaponry, the next domino might fall because someone tweets without thinking, or jokes on the wrong channel. So the next time you hear a dry story about military exercises or declassified protocols, remember this one. Remember that global catastrophe once loomed because of a single voice on a crackly radio. And remember how close we came, not with sirens blaring or bombs falling, but with silence, uncertainty, and one sentence misunderstood. If this story revealed a side of history you never saw before, and you want more hidden truths that shaped our world, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who still thinks the Cold War was all about Berlin walls and spy movies, and subscribe to the Domino Effect, where history isn't just what happened, it's how it almost didn't.